I cannot be more excited to introduce Ryan Rippel, who is a veteran at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Ryan has had a long career there, and he has been the founding director of the U.S. Economic Opportunity and Mobility Program. And Ryan, your personal story, and you're so open about it, talking about growing up in a single-parent household in central Missouri and how it's really inspired you to dedicate your life to these issues around opportunity and mobility, and we're just so grateful that you came all the way here to Boston to be the interlocutor of the amazing Raj Chetty. We'll have more words for you later, Raj, so I will have you come to the podium.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you so much, Tracy, for that kind introduction, and congratulations to Social Finance on this day and the launch of the Institute. It's really an honor to be with you, and I'm honored to have just a brief part, and then we'll get out of your way to hear from Raj, who really has a lot more to say than I do. But as Tracy mentioned, my name's Ryan Rippel, and I lead the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's program on economic mobility in the United States. In rooms like this, which I'm sure many of you are in often, all you need to do is say Raj, and everyone knows who you're speaking of. Perhaps the most preeminent economist for the issues we're about to discuss. I like to kid him that in our field he's become like Madonna or Cher or Sting. You just need his first name. I think that joke has gotten old, Raj, but thanks for bearing with me. And the designation is really well-deserved in our work. In a 2019 profile in The Atlantic, the writer Gareth Cook said, "There is no one who has done more to dispel the myth of social mobility in America." And I would argue that there's no one who's done more to create a national conversation about what we can do to create social mobility for everyone in this country. His data, the famous color-coded maps and the visualizations in the New York Times, have not only put a set of tools in the hands, new set of tools in the hands of many actors, they have helped change the narrative in this country about who is struggling and why. You cannot look at the maps and say that people are poor because they are not working hard enough. Poverty is a consequence of the structures of our place, the policy choices we have made. And through his insights and findings, he and his team have been able to create a space for a conversation even across the political divides about the importance of this issue. They have sparked entire communities to spring into action because of the rankings they have discovered about their standing in creating economic mobility for their residents. And for many of us, they have helped strengthen a movement that we are so happy and honored to be part of. Raj received his PhD from Harvard in 2003, and he is one of the youngest tenured professors in the university's history. He's received many awards, too many to name, but two of great note, a MacArthur Genius Fellowship and the John Bates Clark Medal, given to the economist under 40, whose work is judged to have made the most significant contribution to the field. I will say just on a personal note that my own job probably wouldn't exist if it were not for Raj and his work. In 2014, Bill and Melinda Gates asked me to look into the issues of poverty and opportunity in the U.S. outside of our education work to understand if there was something more we could do. And one of the first people I called and emailed repeatedly was Raj. And he answered again and again. And he spent 2 years traveling with us around the country in 36 different communities to understand what was happening in the United States and help us understand what more we could do about it and the role philanthropy could and should play in this important work. His advice, his encouragement, his insights helped us get a program launched that we're very excited to say this year we'll have given away more than $500 million to these issues around the country. I would say one last thing about Raj. In my experience, the fame and the big speeches and the magazine profiles are not a motivating factor for what he does. He wants to do the best work that he believes can help many others do their best work. And he is devoted to the cause because he knows what is at stake, nothing shorter than the future of our country. So with that, please join me in welcoming Raj Chetty.
Thanks so much, Ryan, for that extraordinarily kind and overly generous introduction. Let me just note that in my view, to the extent we know anything about the science of economic opportunity, I'm going to share what I think we've learned over the past decade. I think it's in large part thanks to Ryan Rippel and the program he initiated to create this ecosystem of learning and knowledge. I also want to very much congratulate Tracy and Karen and the Social Finance Institute in what I think will be a very important step in building on this knowledge to have an impact going forward. And those are the two issues I want to discuss today, starting by telling you what I think we know about the science of economic opportunity and what we're learning from modern large-scale data about what matters, and then transitioning to what in some ways is the more important question: how can we actually change things in terms of economic opportunity going forward? So let me start at a very big picture level with a graph that I think a number of you might have seen, but I think helps set the stage for this conversation, just thinking about the American dream and whether the American dream is well and alive today and what it looks like from a historical perspective. So the American dream, as you all know, has many different aspects to it. I think one central aspect, certainly what drew my own parents to come to this country as immigrants, was the idea that America at least aspires to be a country where through hard work, any child has the chance to move up in the income distribution relative to their parents. And so in a paper my colleagues and I wrote a few years ago, we assessed the extent to which America actually lives up to that aspiration by measuring the fraction of children who go on to earn more than their parents did, measuring both kids' and parents' incomes in their mid-30s and adjusting for inflation. And you can see that for kids born back in the middle of the last century, it was a virtual guarantee that you were going to achieve the American dream of moving up. 92% of children born in 1940 went on to earn more than their parents did. But if you look at what has happened over time, you can see that there's been a dramatic fading of the American dream, such that for children born in the 1980s who are turning 30 around now when we're measuring their incomes as adults, it's become essentially a coin flip, a 50-50 shot as to whether you're going to do better than your parents. So this trend is, of course, of great interest to economists like myself because it reflects a fundamental change in the American economy that we'd like to understand. But I would argue it's also of fundamental social and political interest because I think it's this very trend that underlies a lot of the frustration that people around the United States are expressing, that this is no longer a country where it's easy to get ahead, even through hard work. And so motivated by that trend, in our research and policy group here at Harvard, Opportunity Insights, we're motivated by the big picture question of what is driving the fading of the American dream, and more broadly, what can we do to restore economic opportunity in the US and beyond? How do you increase rates of upward mobility? So there are many people who have been interested in that question for decades. This is a question that's been of interest to social scientists, to policymakers in numerous different spheres. Our angle on it, and I think the reason this is an exciting time to be studying these issues, is that we're, as you all know, living in the era of big data and modern technology where we can study issues with an unprecedented granularity and precision that we haven't been able to in the past. And so in particular, one aspect of what that data allows us to do is break down this national picture in a much finer grained way to start to look across areas, across subgroups, start to make comparisons that can help us better understand what is driving these sorts of broad trends. And so one dimension of that, which is the types of maps that Ryan was referring to in his introduction, again, perhaps a map a number of you have seen, but let me just review what this shows for those who may not have seen it. This is a map that shows you the geography of upward mobility for kids born at the end of that chart that I started out with in the 1980s, showing you what your chances of rising up look like depending upon where you grow up in the United States. Let me just spend a minute summarizing how we construct this map and how we use big data to construct these statistics, and then telling you what I think we learned from it. So what we do here is take data on 20 million children and their parents, essentially all kids born in the US in the early 1980s. We map them back to the areas in which they grew up, dividing the US into 740 different metro and rural areas. And in each of those areas, we calculate a very simple measure of upward mobility. We ask, what is the average income at age 35 for kids who grew up in low-income families? And for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to define a low-income family as a family that's at the 25th percentile of the national income distribution, which corresponds to an income of about $27,000 a year. So to give you an example, here in the Boston metro area, if we look at these kids' own tax filings when they're 35 years old, we see that on average, they're making $36,800 as adults, conditional on growing up in a family that was making $27,000 a year. So we similarly construct that statistic for all of these different metro and rural areas, color the map so that blue-green colors represent areas with higher levels of upward mobility, red-orange colors represent areas with lower levels of upward mobility. And if you look at the scale in the lower right-hand side of this map, you can see, just first, a very simple point, that there's an enormous amount of variation in children's chances of rising up, even in the current generation. There are some parts of the country, if you look at a place like Dubuque, Iowa, or much of the rural Midwest, where kids growing up in families making $27,000 a year are one generation later making $45,000 or even $50,000 a year, a substantial amount of upward mobility in a single generation. Yet there are other places like Charlotte, North Carolina, where kids starting out in families at that exact same income level, remarkably, one generation later are making actually less than their parents were, $26,300, despite the fact that there's, of course, been an enormous amount of economic growth and progress over the past 30 years. So you can see the broad regional variation for yourself, higher rates of upward mobility in the rural Midwest, lower rates of upward mobility in much of the Southeast, certain parts of the coasts have higher levels of upward mobility. And so, the reason I think this map has been interesting to us and a number of others in the field is for two aspects that parallel the structure of this talk. One is, in a sense, these data give us a new lens, a new microscope, if you will, to study the science of economic opportunity. We can start to ask, what's different about Salt Lake City versus Atlanta? What happens when someone moves from one of these cities to another city? All of that can give us, as you'll see in a second, a richer picture of what the drivers of economic mobility are. But second, once we understand that science better, we can also potentially think about how to implement policy interventions in places like Charlotte. What can you change so that you have higher levels of economic mobility there, thereby potentially making the American dream more accessible to all? So motivated by that logic, what I'm going to do here is just in a few minutes summarize a large body of research that's now emerged over the past 10 years since we put out this map, where lots of people have taken these data and brought their own understanding and their own hypotheses to bear and asked, is this related to the quality of schools in an area? Is it related to access to jobs? What happens when certain types of policies are implemented? We've built up a fair bit of knowledge, and I'm going to give you just a quick overview of some of the key takeaways there. And then I'm going to turn to ask, how can we use that body of knowledge to change things going forward? So one starting point that I think is very relevant in this audience with discussion of issues like workforce training and so forth is whether this is just about the types of jobs that are available in different areas. So the simplest, I think, kind of explanation you might have in mind for these differences in upward mobility is, maybe the places that have higher levels of mobility, take a place like the Bay Area, for example. We all know the tech sector has been booming in the last 20, 30 years. Maybe you have relatively high levels of upward mobility there because there are lots of good jobs, high-paying jobs in that sort of place. So to assess that explanation, let's turn to this scatter plot here, where I'm going to take the data from the map that I just showed you for the 30 largest cities in America, rates of upward mobility for kids who grow up in low-income families in those cities, and plot that against just a very simple measure of job growth rates from 1990 to 2010, the period over which these children were growing up. So how many more jobs are there? Or you can ask how many more high-paying jobs are there? You get similar pictures. And when you look at this plot, you can see that there's basically no relationship between these two variables. In particular, if you take the example of Charlotte, which I highlighted before, you can see that Charlotte is an example of a place that is one of the highest job growth cities in America. You might know that Charlotte's often viewed as the engine of jobs in the Southeast in the United States. Yet, as we just saw in the map that we were looking at before, Charlotte ranks lowest among the largest cities in America in terms of rates of upward mobility for the kids who grow up there. So mechanically, how is that happening? How could you have a rapidly growing city that has exceptionally low rates of upward mobility? The way to think about it is that Charlotte is basically importing talent. Lots of people move to Charlotte to get high-paying jobs in the financial sector, for example, that's booming in Charlotte. But what we see in these longitudinal data, where we're able to follow the kids who grew up in Charlotte over time, is that doesn't directly translate to those children having better opportunities. And so a very simple lesson from that analysis is that in thinking about how to create economic mobility, we need to not just provide jobs, but we need to actually provide the human capital and the connections needed for people to get those jobs in a particular area. That doesn't necessarily happen automatically. So it doesn't seem to be about jobs in and of itself. So coming back to the big map here then, what might it be if it's not about jobs? So there are a variety of explanations that you might have in mind. In understanding what the relevant explanations are, it's useful to zoom in and start to look at these data at a finer geographic level than what we're seeing at this aggregate level. So at the national level, your eye is naturally drawn to patterns like the Midwest versus the Southeast and so on. But it turns out you can actually zoom in and look at these data at a much finer geographic level. And we've made these data publicly available through a tool called the Opportunity Atlas, which is a website that you yourself can access, opportunityatlas.org. You can go to that website and type your own home address and look at what economic mobility looks like in your own area or surrounding areas. Here I'm just showing you a snapshot of that data for New York City. So what we've done here is constructed the same statistics that I was showing you initially, but now at the census tract level in New York. There are 70,000 census tracts in America, each of which have 4,000 people in them, roughly. So think of these as very small definitions of neighborhoods. And you can see the exact same statistics we were looking at before, rates of upward mobility now neighborhood by neighborhood in New York City. The simple point that I want to make here, which is evident from looking at this map, is that we haven't changed the color scale on this map, but you can see that the spectrum of colors that you're seeing here within New York is the same as the spectrum of colors that you were seeing in the national map. So what is that telling you? You can drive 2 miles down the road in New York from the Bronx to Queens, for example. We're often on one side of the street versus another side of the street. And it's like you're going from Alabama to Iowa in terms of rates of upward mobility. So the roots of these differences in economic mobility are hyper-local. And what that implies is it's not about broad differences in state policies or regional policies or local labor markets. No, it's often about what's happening on one side of the street versus another side of the street, which makes you think, I think, about a very different set of mechanisms and potential policy interventions. We need to be thinking about this very local community level in order to understand how to make progress. Now, in subsequent studies, we and many others have used these sorts of data to look at the experience of families that move across different neighborhoods. And you see, for example, that the earlier you move as a child to one of these blue-green colored neighborhoods, the better your outcomes look in the long run. So there's a clear causal effect of growing up in one of these higher mobility areas that's related to the dosage or the amount of exposure that you have to these environments. And this kind of data, in my view, is at the end of the day very encouraging because it shows, going back to the very first slide, that you don't need to look back to 1940 to find a time when you had high rates of upward mobility. You can actually look just a couple miles down the road in your own city in the present day and find places where, in some sense, the American dream is well and alive, where kids have great chances of succeeding. And in a way, to me, that makes the problem much more tractable. It shows that we can solve this. We just have to figure out what is different in certain parts of New York or certain parts of other cities and how we might replicate that more broadly. So naturally, a next question then is to ask, okay, we see that local context seems to matter for upward mobility in a causal way. Why is that? What's different about the places that are generating good outcomes for children versus the places that are not? And again, just very briefly summarizing what is now a quite developed field, here are the 4 strongest patterns that researchers have identified as predictors of upward mobility. The first is that places that have lower poverty rates, mixed income communities, tend to have higher rates of upward mobility. So basically reducing segregation by income seems to be strongly positively associated with better outcomes for low-income kids. Second, a strong pattern in the data is that more stable family structures, so the presence of more 2-parent families, for example, is associated with higher rates of upward mobility. Third, as you might expect intuitively, places with better schools, both at the K through 12 level and in terms of access to higher education in relation to Don's earlier remarks, tend to have much higher levels of upward mobility. And finally, places with greater social capital tend to have higher levels of upward mobility. Now, this notion of social capital is something that social scientists have talked about for more than 100 years, including at Harvard, our colleague Bob Putnam, in a famous book, Bowling Alone, that many of you might know, talks about how social capital might be relevant for many different outcomes. I want to spend an additional minute honing in on that factor because I think it's particularly important and seems to cut across explaining what's going on in a number of other domains as well. Now, the idea of social capital, this is another case where we have some sense that things like the strength of your community, who you're connected to, might matter for outcomes, but we've lacked precision in terms of data to be able to really measure social capital, understand where it's high, where it's low, what exactly does it mean, what kind of social capital matters for outcomes like economic mobility. And this is, again, something where we can make progress in the era of big data. So here, our team set up a collaboration with Meta, the company that operates the Facebook platform. And we used the social network data from the Facebook platform to create an unprecedented set of highly granular measures of social capital in a pair of papers that we published in Nature about a year ago. And I'm just going to show you the key punchline that comes out of that analysis that's relevant for what we're discussing here today with this pair of maps. The map on the left is the map of upward mobility that I showed you earlier, constructed using tax records. The map on the right is a map of what we're calling economic connectedness. It's a very simple measure, the fraction of high-income friends that low-income people have on Facebook. And so take the set of people on Facebook in a given county, ask what share of their friends have above median income, color the map so that the blue-green colors on the right represent places with more cross-class interaction. The red colors are places that are more disconnected by class. And you can see the result immediately for yourself. You don't need any fancy statistics here. It's totally obvious that the map on the right looks incredibly similar to the map on the left. More detailed analysis shows that this is the single strongest predictor of economic mobility that we or anyone else has identified to date. And it explains a number of other relationships that have been found in prior research. Basically, places where you have more cross-class interaction are places where people are more likely to rise up, perhaps because those connections matter for getting jobs, perhaps because they change kids' aspirations. If you've never met anyone who's gone to college, maybe you never think about that. If you're in an environment with more of that type of interaction, it changes the path you choose to pursue. So with that sort of whirlwind tour of what people have found in terms of determinants of economic mobility, that local context matters, that it's about where you grow up, that things like social connections really matter, what I want to turn to in the remaining time is thinking about what that means for how we can increase mobility going forward from a policy perspective. And our team is thinking about these issues in three broad domains, which follow, I think, very naturally from the set of results that I just showed you. So the first, if we have the view that economic mobility varies sharply across nearby communities, the first way that you might think about creating more access to opportunity is simply to help people move to higher opportunity areas, to reduce segregation and create more access to these high opportunity neighborhoods. And we've done quite a bit of work in the affordable housing context, for example, or there are other policy changes in the context of zoning laws, for instance, that can have an impact in this space and I think really create measurable change in terms of economic mobility. Now, that is not going to be a scalable approach in and of itself. You can't possibly move everyone to opportunity, and not everyone wants to move. And so it's equally important to think about the complement of that, which is what I think of as place-based investments. Rather than bringing people to opportunity, how do you bring opportunity to people where they currently live? How do you turn the red-colored areas in the maps that I've been showing you to green-colored areas? And that, I think you might think about interventions that are place-focused, like the Harlem Children's Zone or other types of interventions that really seek to change a particular community. And we and others are doing a series of studies to really try to distill how you can turn a low opportunity area into a high opportunity area. Now, the third area where we're focusing is motivated by the fact that after age 18, the key touch point for most kids is not the home in which they're growing up, but the institution of higher education that they might attend. And it's this third area that I want to focus on here, higher education and workforce training in particular, given this audience, and also given that I think there's tremendous potential to make positive changes in this space. So to set this up, I want to first show you some other statistics that our team has constructed that I think shape, at least for me, give me a sense of the landscape in terms of higher education and how it affects economic mobility in the United States. So just like our team has constructed statistics on upward mobility for every neighborhood in America, we've also constructed statistics on how every college in America is contributing to economic mobility. So when you think about colleges, there are two dimensions that you want to think about in terms of a college's contribution to economic mobility. The first, shown on the vertical axis here, is what we're calling the upward mobility rate. So think of this as the set of students who come from a low-income family, say the bottom 20% of the income distribution, and ask what fraction of them reach the top 20% of the income distribution. So for example, places like Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, and so on look terrific on that dimension. The low-income kids who attend these colleges, most of them tend to reach the upper middle class or beyond after graduation. But of course, what matters for a college's contribution to economic mobility is not just how the low-income kids on campus do after they graduate, but also how many low-income kids you have on campus to begin with. And that's what's shown on the horizontal axis, the percentage of the student body that's coming from the bottom 20%. Again, these statistics, they're constructed using data on 30 million students, linking tax record data to Department of Education data, so we get a comprehensive picture of what this landscape looks like. And what you can see is on that dimension, those elite, highly selective private colleges, while they may be great pathways to upward mobility for the few low-income kids who attend there, they don't have very many low-income kids to begin with. And so they can't possibly be contributing a whole lot to economic mobility. Just arithmetically, there's no way if you don't have a very large low-income population. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you can see that there are, each dot here represents a different college in America. There are a number of dots on the right side of this figure. There are a number of colleges that are serving many low-income kids. But unfortunately, at least at present, if we look at the outcomes at those colleges, we don't see great outcomes after college. In fact, there are many colleges in America where earnings levels don't look higher than high school graduates, people who don't go to college at all. And so in a way, the way to think about, I think, the problem in the higher education sector, and more broadly, its relevance for workforce training and so on, is that there are basically no dots in the upper right side of this figure. That's basically where you need to be contributing a great deal to economic mobility. You need to both have a lot of low-income students, and you need to have excellent outcomes after college. And that doesn't really exist. And so the question is, how can you create more of that going forward? And you can sort of tackle the problem, the way our team's thinking about it, is in two intuitive dimensions. How do you move those dots that are on the upper left over to the right? We've done a series of studies and some work we put out recently on how you can change admissions policies at elite colleges to potentially create more diversity on campus. But I think in some ways more important than that is how you can take these dots that are on the lower right, educating enormous numbers of kids, and improve outcomes at those places. And one particular angle, there are many ways in which you might think about doing that, and there are many ways in which researchers are thinking about these issues. I want to focus here on one very specific angle that I think is relevant in this context and seems promising, which is workforce training programs. You can think of them as basically trying to create pathways that focus on kids from lower income backgrounds, disadvantaged backgrounds, and perhaps produce better outcomes. And I'm going to show you some data from a recent analysis that we've been doing that I think shows promise, but also makes a methodological point that I know a number of people here, interested in evaluating these sorts of programs might find useful going forward, and is at the root of a collaboration that we're actually launching with the Social Finance Institute. So I'm going to focus here on the Year Up program, which I think a number of you here will be familiar with, a sectoral job training program that's a one-year program that basically connects disadvantaged people to employers and gives them a set of skills that might put them on a better career trajectory. Now, the Year Up program in past experimental evaluations has been shown to be really successful. So here I'm showing some data from an evaluation of the program that was done as a randomized trial with people who enrolled in the program in 2014 And what we've done here in a collaboration with Year Up is linked their data to tax record data that our team is analyzing to look at earnings impacts. And you can see that if you compare the treatment group, which participated in Year Up, which was given by chance the opportunity to participate in Year Up, if you look at their earnings over time, they go up quite significantly after they participate in the program. There's a dip while they're in the program in 2014, and then they surge afterward relative to the control group shown in the orange, with an earnings gain of about $9,000 a year that persists for many years. So this randomized trial is, of course, very encouraging and suggests that this is a promising program that maybe we want to scale and since has been scaled and I think is on that path going forward. What I want to focus on is a slightly different aspect of it, which is a different way to evaluate the impacts of this program. So many of you who are running these types of programs, if you ask an academic, how can I prove, I know from the experiences people in my program are having that it seems really successful. How can I prove that to potential funders, to policymakers, to scale this? The answer usually is run a randomized trial. Running a randomized trial, as you know, is expensive, it's challenging, there are potentially ethical concerns. If you have something that you think works, why deny it at random to some people, and so on. What I want to show you is a different approach that's feasible in the era of big data that our team is trying to develop, that I think shows some signs of promise. And this is the idea of using a matching method just with the observational data that we have, where what we're doing here is taking everybody who participated in the Year Up program and think of it as essentially trying to find their twin, looking for someone who has the same racial background, same gender, same age, and lives in exactly the same census tract, and look at the profile of earnings for that group of people. Now, this is only feasible because we have data on the entire US population, so you can do this very precise matching. It was infeasible in the past. And the earnings trajectory for that group is being plotted in the black. And what you can see here, it might seem like kind of a wonky thing, but I think it's actually incredibly important and practically useful, as you'll see in a second. That black series is almost identical to what you get in the control group. And so what that means is you could have gotten the same result even without running this experiment. You could have taken the set of people who participated in Year Up, found these comparable set of people, and you would have gotten the right answer in terms of the effects of this program. And in particular, you would have correctly concluded that there is a $9,000 gain from participating in Year Up as the program was implemented in 2014 when they did this randomized trial. Now, why is this method useful? So this $9,000 estimate applies to the 2014 version of the Year Up program. So the program, like any other program, has been developing over time. With the randomized trial, since it was only run in 2014, you only know what the effects of the program were as it existed at that point in time. But once you have this matching method, once you have this method of using the observational data, you've kind of broken out of those shackles and you can sort of you can evaluate the impacts of the program, not just in the context of that trial in 2014, but more broadly. And so to show you what that looks like, this purple dot here is the $9,000 estimate that we get if we look at the program as it was implemented in 2014, exactly what I showed you in the previous slide, earnings impact 1 year after program completion. But now what we can do is plot the same earnings impacts in different years for people who participated in Year Up in 2008, 2009, 2010, and so on, when there was no experiment, but we were able to do the exact same matching method that I showed you in the 2014 data. And what you see is, I think, a very cool and encouraging result, which is that the program's impacts are steadily improving over time. So actually, the 2014 impacts understate the effectiveness of the program as it exists more recently. There's also, I think, a cautionary note in terms of running randomized trials. I think it's a good thing that they waited to run the RCT till 2014. If you had run it back in 2008, right when the program was getting going, you may have seen much smaller effects and been discouraged by that. And so this shows you that there's value in using these kinds of observational methods. And I think they provide a toolkit to learn when programs are most effective. So to give you an example of that, while there's growth overall in the impacts of Year Up, that varies across different places. So for example, in one of the sites where the program's being implemented here, you see steady growth in the impacts over time. but there's no guarantee that that happens everywhere. In another site in their data, you actually see that the impacts remain relatively constant over time. And so then you can start to ask, why are we seeing that in certain places our program impacts are not growing? What can we do there to retool things, and so on? And so that's a technique that we hope to develop more broadly. We're starting a partnership with the Social Finance Institute to link in data from other programs. If any of you might be interested in participating in that, we'd certainly be interested in hearing from you, basically taking existing program data that you might have, linking it to this sort of data infrastructure, and getting a clearer understanding of what works and monitoring what might matter going forward as well. So let me end by talking about why I think this all matters. I think it matters not just for creating pathways to economic mobility for specific individuals, but as Ryan put it in his introduction, for the future of our country more broadly. And one way to see that is that I think we're sort of wasting an enormous amount of talent in the United States by not providing people with the opportunities to succeed and realize their potential. And here's one piece of data from some analysis we've done that makes that point. So here we've linked the universe of patent records in the US to the tax record data. And we're showing how your chances of becoming an inventor in America, as measured by having a patent, relate to your parents' income. And you can see that if you happen to be born to parents in the top 1% of the income distribution, you're 10 times more likely to become an inventor than if you happen to be born to a lower income family. And so when you look at it from that perspective, the fact that we don't have opportunities available for all of the reasons that we've been discussing for kids from lower income families, it matters not just for those own kids' futures, but it matters in terms of the drugs that are discovered, the new technologies that are developed, the businesses that are started, that ultimately will impact all of our lives and impact economic growth. And the scale of this problem that we're calling lost Einsteins is quite substantial. We estimate in this analysis that if women, kids from underrepresented minority backgrounds, and kids from low-income families were to invent at the same rate as high-income white men, you'd have 4 times as many inventors in America as you presently do. And so in that sense, I think there's an enormous amount at stake in terms of solving these problems. And I'm delighted that all of you are engaged in these issues. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you, Raj. I want to be sure that we open this up to all of you, because I'm sure you have questions. So I'm going to just kill a little time by asking 1 or 2 questions while you think of yours. And I promise we'll end on time, because I'll be in real trouble with my wife if we don't, and I miss my flight to St. Louis. So Raj, let me just take a step back for a moment. You have, with your research, made very profoundly clear to all of us that opportunity differs greatly in this country by place and race. And I'm curious how you would describe the moment we're in today. Much of your work looks back at a birth cohort from 1980, but how would you characterize or project what's happening for kids today who are growing up today? Where are things likely to get better for them, or are we on a very similar trajectory as we have been with the escalators going down?
Yeah, so thanks for that, Ryan. I mean, I think one of the virtues of having now more data as time passes, basically the gift of time, is that we're able to study how economic opportunity is changing across birth cohorts. And in the next paper that our team will put out in a couple of months, that's exactly what we're seeking to do. And we're actually seeing, quite significant changes, even over a 10 or 15-year period, in terms of levels of economic mobility across cities. I won't sort of get ahead of myself and say too much there, but basically let me summarize by saying that there's certain pockets of America where we're seeing significant improvements in economic mobility. For Black Americans, for example, there are actually some positive developments in some places. For white Americans, less so, and it varies across areas. So again, it's a more nuanced picture than just saying economic mobility is going up or down. But what we're taking away from that data is that while a lot of these issues have long historical roots, you can see connections to where rates of slavery were high, for example, or rates of redlining back in the 1930s. At the same time, things can change very rapidly. And so I think we're in a period of flux where for some groups, opportunities, quite fortunately rising, but for other groups, unfortunately, it's declining quite significantly.
Thank you. You shared some at the end about things that work, where there's evidence to show they do create uplift. And I'm curious if you would add anything to the list that you didn't have a chance to share now, but also for those of us who are nonprofits or funders, what are the things that aren't working too that we should consider shifting away from, if you have a list?
So a common theme that we're seeing in a lot of our work evaluating programs in many different sectors, from affordable housing to education to job training, is that programs that couple what I would call a social capital intervention or social support with financial resources or with education are far more effective than something that just tries to deliver a single thing. So let me give you a couple of examples. I gave you the example of job training in Europe. Europe is representative of a new set of sectoral job training programs that I think have the characteristic of not just teaching people a certain set of technical skills, which is what traditional job training programs did, and I think didn't have a great record of success, but doing that in addition to connecting people to specific employers who want to hire for that set of skills, so building those connections, and also providing mentoring and wraparound support services that really help people use those skills and get somewhere with them. And so that's an example of a program that by combining those elements seems far more successful than just giving people a specific set of skills. To take a very different example, in some work our team has done in Seattle in the affordable housing space, we look at the housing voucher program, which many of you may know. We spend billions of dollars giving families rental assistance with the aim and part of helping them move to better neighborhoods to access opportunity. But when we look at the data, we find that, in fact, people who receive housing vouchers from the federal government, even though they could afford to live in a much better neighborhood with better schools, higher social capital, and so on, they end up not actually moving there. And so effectively what we did is a social capital intervention where people got the vouchers, but they also got connected to a counselor who helped them navigate the housing search process, helped them connect with landlords, negotiate with landlords, and so forth. And this dramatically increased, it quadrupled the fraction of families who ended up moving to high opportunity areas, putting their kids on a fundamentally different trajectory. So I could give you a series of examples like this, Ryan. I think this lesson spans across sectors, and so I would urge all of you, traditionally, my sense is at least in the public policy domain and government, the debate is usually about how many dollars do we spend on the voucher program or on this or on that, and less on how do we actually implement that in a way where we connect people to those resources and help them best take advantage. And I think there's more to be done there in many domains.
Great. I want to ask one other question about gender. There's been a lot written recently that boys and girls growing up in the United States are on very different economic trajectories today. And I want to ask you what your research has found about gender differences in economic mobility in the US.
Yeah. So we find very stark differences in economic mobility by gender that interact with race. So in particular, Black men have significantly lower rates of upward mobility than white men. But in contrast, Black women have very similar rates of economic mobility to white women. And so in understanding the origin of racial disparities and the persistence of racial disparities in the United States, it's critical to understand why Black men in particular have faced such challenges in rising up. Part of it might have to do with issues related to the criminal justice system, very high rates of incarceration and so on, and maybe related to discrimination in the labor market. Whatever the underlying reason is, I think, again, there's reason to target our programs to particular populations like that in certain neighborhoods that can make a real difference. And more broadly, what we're finding over time, and there are people like Richard Greaves who are really focusing on these issues, that over time, you see that men in particular from lower income backgrounds, more generally, are really facing challenges in terms of finding employment, completing high school. We see much higher rates of college attendance now for women than men. And so I think that's definitely an area to focus on in terms of creating mobility going forward.
Thank you, Raj. We have the sign that says time is up, so and it's too bad because I was going to ask you to give policy advice to the 24 presidential candidates, 2021. So you've dodged that one. You've dodged that one. But thank you so much for your presentation and for the work you're doing.
Thank you so much, Ryan and Raj. And Ryan, don't if you need to scoot, because I know you have to head back to family. We're going to be very brief. But first of all, Raj, you have completely reshaped the field of economic mobility with big data, whether it's IRS data or Facebook data or any kind of data. And more importantly, you've sparked a massive public debate of what constitutes fairness, opportunity, the American dream, all the fundamental building blocks of our democracy. And we just cannot imagine a scholar with greater real-world impact than you. And we're so humbled to be partnering with you and your colleagues at Opportunity Insights to take this work to the next level, to think about workforce programs. So this is the plan. We are going to all mingle. I think Raj is going to stay a little bit at reception. But I hope that what you've heard today is just a glimpse of the kinds of conversations that we will facilitate, and importantly, to compel action by all of you through the Social Finance Institute going into the future. But if I were sitting in your seats and you've heard all these conversations, starting off with two Federal Reserve Bank presidents talking about all kinds of curves and unemployment and labor market dynamics, to then another panel hearing from the largest employer in the Commonwealth and the largest producer of nurses in the country in Western Governors University, and then a wonderful public sector colleague talking about the important levers that government can use to make the world better. And then yet another panel talking about the wide spectrum of capital, from traditional capital markets all the way to grant making and all the wonderful buckets that our friend and board member Laura Lauder talks about in between to make the world a better place. John Green talked about home ownership and some of these insidious practices that still exist in this country. And talking about donor advised funds and the future of philanthropy, et cetera. So if you hadn't spent enough time with social finance, you would be thinking, and Don Graham did say this, your work is complicated. How do you tie all these themes together? And I want to go back to how we started this program. What social finance does is not really the what, it's not a particular set of issue areas that we focus on, but really about how to make more resources, public resources, private resources, philanthropic resources, to flow towards measurable impact. Whether it's thinking about outcomes very differently, Raj talked about inputs versus outcomes. How do you intentionally focus on measuring outcomes? Whether it's thinking about new partnerships to have government and markets work more effectively together. Whether it's about applying the right kind of capital to the right problem that has the right business model. These are the things that our colleagues and we just love thinking about, love implementing, and we're so excited to invite you on the journey with us as we launch the Social Finance Institute to mainstream these approaches so that hopefully we see more of these in the world and in our society. But let me end a wonderful day and afternoon together by thanking three sets of people. First, this day would not have been possible without Karen and your team, Meg Massey and Josh Breeden and Sam and Jess and all the people who just work so, we're not events people. And we work very closely with David's team at the Academy to make this a reality, and I know just how much work that went into it. So thank you to our colleagues that made this possible. Second, huge thanks to our board. Many of them are sitting here in the front row. You challenged us, you interrogated our theory of change several years ago, and here we are today, Ian Simmons and Liesl and Pam, our board chair, and all the other board members here. It's happening, but it's you who challenge us to take our work to the next level, and we're just grateful for your support. And then finally, many of our supporters are in this room today. It's obviously, your generous financial support is making this possible, but also your advice, your encouragement, your counsel, your wisdom. So thanks to then all of you for spending the afternoon with us. So please enjoy the conversation outside, and we'll be all hanging out. So thank you again.